Hello and welcome to Self Talk. I'm your host, Rachel Astarte. Today I have as my guest Ben Oofana. He began his training at the age of 20 with one of the last surviving traditional doctors or medicine men among the Kiowa Indian tribe. Ben helps people to heal their bodies, minds, broken hearts, and other deep emotional wounds while helping them to increase their capacity to love and be loved, realize their true potential, and fulfill their life's purpose. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, thank you, Rachel.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about something that's been coming up a lot, not just in my practice, maybe you've encountered it too, but I see it a lot in social media and on the news, which is midlife and midlife transitions and how difficult they can be for many of us. But before we get into that, I wonder if you could just speak to the listeners a little bit about how you got to be where you are, what brought you to the work that you do.
Even from a very early age, like maybe 3-4 years old, I just had this affinity towards Native Americans and peoples of other indigenous cultures, and and even at the age of 14, hearing about the traditional Native doctors and the experiences they had, the capacity they had to facilitate healing, I decided this is what I'll do with my life if ever given the opportunity. At 17, I took off on my own, and my car carried me as far as Oklahoma. I landed in a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians, ended up spending many nights sitting up in the teepees with Kiowa elders, apprenticed. That led to me apprenticing with one of the last surviving traditional doctors, Horace Delkai, who passed on portions of his own healing gifts to me. And then he had me go on the vision quest, where we go out the 4 days and nights to fast without food and water to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
If you don't mind my asking, what was that like, and how were you welcomed into such a sacred and predominantly, one would think, private lineage of education? So here your car just kind of lands you there, and you're like, "Hey, can I come and sit in on some good stuff?" How did that happen?
Well, I had met a number of Kiowa folks when some actually lived in Texas, because a lot of Native people would go down and to work in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And then others would come to visit. So I had those connections. I was thinking I'd go to Tuba City, Arizona to enroll in boarding school so I could complete high school, because I hadn't finished yet. But my car died in Oklahoma. And so one of the young friends I met who was visiting, he introduced me to his father, who was at that time the elected president of the Kiowa chapter of the Native American Church, which is the group that runs the peyote meetings. So that was my doorway in. It was a mixed response. I mean, there was a number of Native people that did have a certain animosity, just because I was non-Native by birth, obviously. And but this elderly man, Jack, who first took me into the meetings, and he says, where the others said, well, don't let him come in. And Jack just said, this one is different. Let him come in. And so he, took me into the meetings, and people, for the most part, deferred to him. And then when I went on to apprentice with my mentor, Horace, people were intimidated by Horace. I mean, he was so extraordinarily powerful. And so it's like, no, whatever he says, whatever. But Horace had this outrageous sense of humor too, he's because a lot of the native people were Christianized, and
Yeah.
these crack jokes about, if you just grow a beard and we'll put you in a white robe and then we'll have you come into the teepee and then they'll think I'm really powerful.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because that's usually the first, that's the dream, isn't it? Is that someone
Hmm.
sees you and says, this one's different.
Hmm.
This one is not what you think, just because of what he might look like on the outside or what his genetic lineage might be. That's beautiful.
I remember, like, at one point, they call them doctrine meetings, and that's where they have a peyote meeting specifically for where one of the traditional doctors will treat a patient. And so before this meeting, and because I knew a lot of the people who were more hardline, if you're white, it's like, you're not coming in. And I
Hmm.
was so afraid Horace would toss me out. And, but yeah, we're lining up in front of the teepee, and then we walk around, we go in. Oh, but before that, I'm talking with my friend who's about my age. I'm like 17 at the time. And Horace is across the hall, and he just stops, and there's this piercing stare, like he's just looking right through me. I
Mm.
think in that instant, he knew something. And he was actually speaking to me within the meeting itself, just, I think recognizing something is wanting to make that connection,
Yeah.
and so, um, yeah. And then after about another year of college, when my grades are starting to go down, I realized, wow, I'm not doing what I need to do with my life. And I made my way out to New Mexico and
Hmm.
to go apprentice with them.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love New
Yeah.
Mexico. Um,
Mhm.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And so gently transitioning to our topic today about midlife. Now,
Mhm.
you mentioned that, that as we exchanged emails a little bit
Mhm.
back and forth before we met here, that midlife is a time of transition, which
Mhm.
many of us understand, but there's also a feeling of overwhelm that can
Mhm.
come. So much is changing. Men have andropause, women have menopause. There's and the person that we've spent decades creating is now going into a whole different form of being.
Mhm.
So like, we don't even know who we are in our 20s. We're figuring it out. By the time we're in our 30s, we're practicing what we think might be the person that we are. By our 40s, maybe we're a little more settled in it. But then we hit 50s, 60s, we're like, oh, wow. So there's so much change physically, emotionally, spiritually, and it can be overwhelming.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that sense of overwhelm, how why it exists, and what we might do um, to manage it.
When you consider all the changes that are occurring as we move into our 40s and on up, our 50s and our 60s, and our physical appearance is
Mm-hmm.
changing. Often we're gaining weight, our skin is changing, just all kinds of physical things. And so, and we live in a culture that places so much emphasis on physical appearance. And so with that, those differences, also a lot of relationships, for instance, that began in their 20s and 30s are coming to an end.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us um, find ourselves single again.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're back out into the dating pool, and it's a whole different reality. Whereas before that, we met with friends, we spent time engaged and connecting with one another, and now we're in this reality that, in many respects, is much more disconnected, where we're interfacing through digital media instead of having conversations. And, so there's that. There's also career changes in many instances because there's these developmental cycles that we go through. And maybe we have this passionate drive and inspiration that carries us into one cycle of our development, a certain career direction. But after, 10, 20 or more years, it's like we've cycled through that. I noticed a lot of things. I'm able to, because of all the training development I've gone through, scan people's physical bodies and minds. And so oftentimes what I see when I look into people's bodies and minds is it's as if there's this running out of gas. Like, okay, you have like children, from infancy, childhood, adolescence, these generative cycles, just one after another. And it's just kind of self-perpetuating. But as we get older, starting our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and on, those cycles don't perpetuate themselves in the same way. Now, indigenous peoples, for instance, among Native Americans, they had these various interventions, processes, and even in different parts of Asia where there were a lot of internal practices that people did in, say, the Taoist lineages, and that's in China, for instance. But we lack that in this culture, whereas that, where Native people would work with the traditional doctors, going through various healing ceremonial practices, myself and my own continued training, going through the vision quest where I'm fasting the 4 days and nights without food and water. Because, when we experience a lot of the losses, like when relationships break apart, most people never fully process or digest those experiences. Hardships, like financial hardships, like where we're struggling financially to make it, loss of employment, like if we lose jobs and stuff, all these things, when they hit us, and that impact, from these losses, which are in many respects devastating. And also there's just the low-grade stress as well. That's just a continuing reality, working in jobs that we hate or just that we find boring at the least. Is that accumulates in our body. There's this residual of all the stresses and the emotions that don't process, and it just builds up. It's this cumulative effect. Whereas like you have, children, teens, and 20-somethings, they don't have all that accumulation. But as we get older and that accumulation builds up, then it's like all the stagnation that's built up in the body. And the fact that most people haven't learned to work constructively with their emotions, it's just building and building. It just continues to accumulate. And so with all that stagnation, it greatly impedes like those next generative developmental cycles, so that, as we're moving further from our 30s to our 40s to our 50s, so maybe we cycle out of a relationship, we cycle through a certain career stage, but we don't have the gas to move into the next stage. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. Yeah. And I think that, and you also mentioned sometimes past trauma can start to surface during this time as well. Do you find that is sort of part and parcel of this inability to fuel yourself for the next stage? I mean, when we have past trauma that's not resolved, and then a new trauma can come in, like the end of a relationship or a career change, or just the bodily changes that are going on, that past trauma can start to really tickle us again, or come back into the forefront. So then it really feels like there's this huge pile on, right, of pain and then that sense of overwhelm.
It has a compounding effect because, and it goes both ways in a sense that because we carry a lot of these early deeply wounding experiences or traumas, there's a tendency that we tend to, we're sort of magnetic. We attract to us individuals and experiences that are in many ways reenactments of these early life traumas. And when that happens too, that evokes powerful emotional responses, which the emotional response, and often it's hard to differentiate, is a combination of our present moment experience and the old historical. So these two things are going on simultaneously. The more you do deep emotional work, the easier it does become to differentiate, but you could also feel the overlap between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And also the greater the extent of the trauma, because along with trauma, there's a certain amount of incapacitation, learned helplessness. There's with trauma, there's often elements of varying degrees of dissociation. The more dissociated we are, the less we are in touch with our body and mind's innate resources to affect change in our lives. There's also, as I look into people's bodies and minds, it's like a lot of the resources, the faculties fail to develop. When I scan people's bodies and minds, I see a vast difference in terms of, I see a lot of people, and it's not like they're defective or stupid or something's innately wrong with them, but because they suffered a lot of this emotional wounding and trauma, there's a lot of the developmental processes are interrupted. And also there's the fact that because they're interrupted, maybe they weren't quite as engaging or took as lived as fully as they could have. And so therefore a lot of resources just didn't develop.
Mm-hmm.
But, on a daily basis, I feel it's so crucial. Like I suffered a lot of trauma, for instance, in my childhood and adolescence. It hit me early, especially, when you take this transmission of power from a traditional native doctor, that's a pretty intense, extraordinary power that is projecting into your body. And it's like pouring hydrogen peroxide into a wound. So all that infection's coming out. And so as that was happening in my 20s, when a lot of people were just carefree and running around and having a blast, and here I was dealing with the repercussions, what hits a lot of people in their later 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was hitting me early on. So I got a head start on a lot of what many other people are dealing with. Mm-hmm. And so I feel it's so crucial, like, okay, we have experiences, people or situations, and they trigger us emotionally. And so the importance of being able to work constructively with our emotional responses, the fact that if we're not able to do so, if we can't work with our emotions or just haven't learned how, let's say, is that those emotions are not going to go away. Right. Having a drink or smoking weed at the end of the day or something, or midday or whenever we do, okay, maybe it takes the edge off, but it's actually impeding our ability to do the deep level processing of those emotions. A lot of people overwhelmed with their emotions, well, then they go on psychotropics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds. And I feel in their bodies like how it's interrupting that circuit, that enables them to fully process those emotions. And so a lot of that emotion is trapped in the body still. And that greatly impedes that ongoing healing developmental process. So the more that we're able to access our emotions and be present with them, thoroughly digest and assimilate those emotional responses, and can cycle through that, that helps to facilitate this ongoing developmental process we need to go through. Now, the thing is, like, a lot of people don't get in this culture that was a part of ancient traditional cultures, is the part of therapeutic interventions. For instance, if we're holding all this stagnation, even one, the fact that a lot of people don't know how to work constructively with their emotions. If you're working with a gifted psychotherapist that helps to actually connect you with your emotions and helps you to walk you through the process of, that processing of your emotions, that's important. But even continuing from there, deep tissue body work, a lot of the emotions trapped in the body, all through the musculature, ligaments and tendons, everything, it brings these emotions up. Consistent body work, so that once you bring these emotions up and you're feeling them, and I know a lot of people don't want to feel, but instead of not going there, we need to go there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You have to go through it. You can't go around it. Yeah.
Yeah. The only way is to go through it. In different traditions, there are interventions. Within the Hindu Vedic traditions, the priests do a practice called yagyas, if I pronounce it right. It's a longer version of puja, and where they're doing these intensive chants. They could even do it at a distance, and you could feel that power, that presence working within and around your body, and it helps you to process a lot of stuff. When the traditional doctors work with people, when I work with people individually, it's I work as a conduit. This extraordinarily powerful presence comes through me, and it's basically takes people into this intense dreamlike state, and all this stagnant emotional content is being transmuted, transformed. People are digesting this years of life experience, all this backlog of emotional content. Also, like my own training, where I go through the vision quest, I've gone dozens of times. I'm going like the 4 days and nights, no food and water, alone in the mountains. So as I do that too, sometimes it's like a near-death experience. Portions of my life are flashing before my eyes, and I'm reliving these experiences. And often I'm just like, wow, I didn't realize all that was living inside me still. And it's like often the experience and the emotions, all that, are even more vivid than when it initially happened. And it's just so, the deep level processing of our emotions and the interventions, when we combine that, instead of just stagnating, accumulating the stagnation, also the contraction. Because when we take these hits in our lives and we're dealing with this, in some instances, relentless stress, there are ways in which our body and minds just contract around that. And so when that happens, it's like there's this buildup, and we lose touch with that spark, that inspiration, that deep inner core of our being. And so with the practices, the interventions, it's we're feeding, we're nourishing, cultivating that inner presence. It's growing stronger so that it emanates from us, it flows through us, and it carries us forward into subsequent stages of our growth.
Right, because if we're stuck, obviously, as we were saying earlier, you can't transition the way that you need to transition into the next life cycle. So for people in midlife, I like to call it the wisdom sharing era, but we haven't even reached elderhood. And so we would miss out on such an important aspect of our being, our purpose, if we're stuck trying to be 30 again, or stuck in the pain of all of these radical changes that are going on. And I love what you said about, because we're not pathologizing what's happening. We are not saying that people are broken, although it can feel that way, but the people who experience this, and most of us do in one way or another, with all of the work that you've done, you were saying this is still coming up.
Hmm.
But to say to when I work with my clients, I like to say at when we get good at this stuff, we say, bring it on.
Hmm.
I this is helping me to clear out what's stagnant in me. And that's a beautiful and loving process, even if what's coming up is painful,
Hmm.
because the pain needs the love to have it be healed,
Hmm.
and that comes from us. Um, so so when you work with
Oh,
people who
before
are,
you go on,
yeah, go ahead.
you made some important points here that
Yeah,
were
sure.
good. Um, so there's two things. When we talk about self-love, is that when when we're denying, um, when we're not going there, when we shut down emotionally, we numb ourselves out, when we pour alcohol and other recreational drugs over the top of what we don't want to feel or throw
Mhm.
pharmaceuticals at it, um, that means we're not being present with parts of ourselves. When we're not being present with parts of ourselves, we are not accepting these parts of ourselves. We are not loving these parts of ourselves. And so we need to understand that self-love means becoming more and more and more fully present. And the other things where people talk about honesty, well, there's given truthful answers, but when we're avoiding issues, not wanting to face or deal with issues, when we're suppressing our emotions, in that instance, we're not being honest with ourselves, and therefore we can't be fully honest with anyone else for that matter.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a good point. And that gets into shadow work, which you also
mhm,
do.
mhm,
This idea of the disowned parts of ourselves.
mhm,
And sometimes we've disowned beautiful things. That's the golden shadow, right? Disowned
mhm,
our power, disowned our self-love, and we give it to a guru or a teacher, and we don't realize it lives within us as well.
mhm,
But this other part, the pain part, excuse me, where uh I have no boundaries, I have terrible negative self-talk, and I have so much trauma, and I'm so overwhelmed, and I'm so, never mind just the midlife part of it that just everybody has to go through. There's all this stuff that we've been carrying can make us begin to identify with our pain
mhm.
instead of understanding it as something that is asking to be healed. I think that's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people sink down into the pain. They get consumed and they get overwhelmed by it because, you mentioned the self-talk and these negative or destructive internal voices. They're actually fueled by the emotions that
Mhm.
we suppress. And the more we can process these emotions, what happens is it it diffuses, it weakens, dissolves that negative internal dialogue. It becomes less and less. And so the internal dialogue becomes much more supportive. When we're suppressing emotions, when we're a lot of times we have these parts of ourselves that are deeply wounded and we don't want to go there, we don't want to feel that. And so we're sitting way up here in our heads, in this kind of disconnected state, and that woundedness, we're trying to push it down. We keep trying
Right,
to
right, right.
shove it down there. And so what happens is, well, we can do it to a certain extent, but then it just engulfs us and it
Yeah,
takes over.
yeah.
And so the more that we do the deep internal processing with our emotions, make use of the interventions, we're actually building. Um, One, we shrink down the mass of all the confusion and chaos. The more we digest, we're diminishing that mass of all the craziness inside of us. We actually, as we digest it, we integrate it
Mm.
as it becomes a functional aspect of our being. It also serves as fuel for growth. But there's also this, and this is what a lot of people don't grasp because of not being able to look into the bodies and minds as I do, is that there's also this building of faculties and resources. And
Mhm.
so that with that, there's like higher levels of functioning.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it takes time, and it
Hmm.
takes practice, and it takes being present in it. And even that fear of addressing the darker parts, addressing the wounded parts,
Mhm.
that also tends to go away once we realize there is nothing to fear
Mhm.
in this work.
Mhm.
The unpleasantness is, yeah, to me, it's almost like I see it as a wounded animal.
Mhm.
So we don't avoid a wounded animal. We do what we can to help that wounded animal to some extent, if it's not unsafe to do so,
Mhm.
but in this case, it's our wounded animal. It's our self. So
Mhm.
the work is something that we can do lovingly, but understand that it's not a quick fix. Right. So I appreciate there is that processing of the emotions, and the more we do it, obviously, as it is with anything else, the better we get at it. And it's just a different way of seeing what is broken in us. Yeah, I put air quotes for people who are just listening to the podcast and not watching. We are not broken, but I put broken in air quotes. Things that are not functioning for us properly.
See, I've also trained for 17 years thus far with Shifu Li Tailiang, a master in the internal martial arts of Xingyi Quan, Baguazhang, Tai Chi, Qigong. And a lot of these masters in these internal martial arts traditions that have their roots in Taoism, they start training in early childhood, maybe like 4 or 5 years old, hours of intensive practice on a daily basis. And so they're continually building this foundation, and it gets stronger and stronger. One of the great, we have advantages in our modern day world. A lot of conveniences and comforts we enjoy, but we don't have the advantage of, this intensive discipline, because you see these individuals and they just develop this extraordinary power. And even some of these old masters, you asked me, do you want to go up against this 20-something-year-old, or would you rather fight this old master here? Oh, I'll take the 20-something. And because that old master possesses so much power that he could literally, if he strikes me, he can use that internal power, and it would actually rupture internal organs, or send me flying across the room or something. Yeah, so it's like the magnitude of power is so much greater. So in our culture here, we it's too much based on the external, physical appearance and all. Whereas like within these ancient traditional cultures, these old Native American these old yogis, these masters in these Taoist systems, their power is actually so much greater than somebody in their 20s or 30s.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful transition back into really specifically talking about midlife and aging and the power that we have. Now, I understand what you're talking about is years and years and years of building up practice.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take it into the West for a second, where we don't necessarily, we have access to it, but it's not part of our culture. And in fact, we get the opposite when we talk about um, societal expectations, or as you mentioned at the top of the show about, having to look a certain way, having to earn a certain amount of money at a certain age, having to be on a path that the Western view of things really doesn't leave a lot of room for that level of self-growth. And it's really more surface stuff, literally surface stuff, your bank account, your skin, your body, the car you drive, the house you live in.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would be some suggestions you might have for people listening who are saying yes, yes, yes to everything we're talking about? What even minor shifts can they begin to do on their own? Ideally, yes, we want them to go get a good therapist and go get a body worker, and ideally even work with some of these more traditional healing methods if that's possible. But what can they do today within themselves to maybe just shift their perspective a little bit?
See, my concern with that is a lot of people are so looking for a quick, instantaneous fix.
Mm-hmm.
And we're dealing with these realities on a daily basis, as far as the wanting to look like we did in our 20s, and having this the bank account and the beautiful home and the car and the perfect relationship and all these things. And that's, this messaging is continuous. It's on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So we had that messaging on one hand, and then we have the emotional wounding that we carry from our past and the day-to-day realities that we're dealing with, and being sandwiched between these elements that can only do damage, and so and I know, like, there are a lot of times people come to me seeking assistance, and they have this absurd notion that they think in one session that it's just going to fix them.
Yeah.
And yet the wounding spans decades, often going back to childhood.
Yeah.
That's why I want to encourage people. I feel it's so crucially important that, anything worthwhile, many of us, we went through grade school and then on into college, and some of us earned masters and even doctorates. And so there's this investment in our education, and some went on to medical and law school and all that. And so when it comes to healing and our ongoing development, there is no quick fix.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel it's such a profound deficit. There's this profound gap in our understanding here. And so we need to learn the practices. One thing I teach people to do, everyone I work with, unless they're comatose, I work with people have me work with their family members who are not conscious sometimes. I help people who are dying at times to make their transition.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone else who is conscious, I have them do this practice, like, have them bring to their awareness what's going on in their life, be it in their relationships, in their career, whatever's affecting them, bring it into their awareness. As they do that, okay, what do you feel in response to it? When you become aware of the feelings, where are they situated in your body?
Yes. Yes.
Are they in your chest cavity, further down your abdomen? Some people, they could be up in the throat, maybe moving further to the back. Where do you feel those emotions?
Mm-hmm.
Center your awareness deep in those emotions. Breathe very softly, very deeply. Follow the feelings and sensations as they go through their progression. No matter what therapeutic interventions you do, if you incorporate this practice, whether it's psychotherapy, if you're doing deep tissue body work, if you're working with a gifted healer such as myself, if you're really hardcore and go on the vision quest like me, whatever, just whatever you do, if you need to be doing the deep level processing of your emotions for any therapeutic intervention to be truly effective. And I have found the less people are able to access their emotions, the more shut down, locked up they are emotionally. That freezes them up internally. I have a close family member, she quit going to get therapeutic massages. And it's like, why? And she's like, well, I couldn't tell he was doing anything. I couldn't see that as helping. And it's like, yeah, because you're so shut down and locked up emotionally that, and that's holds all that tension in your body. And
Yeah.
I would say that's the most important practice that I would encourage people to do. And at the same time, I also encourage people to delve into these traditions, make use of these interventions, because just considering the extraordinary amount of stress that we deal with at this time in history, the challenges we faced. We're pulled in so many different directions. We're on sensory overload with all this, like, social media, and we got all these devices and emails, to answer, respond to, and horrible boundaries between work, that spills over into what's supposed to be our individual time. We need to be processing, we need to be digesting.
Yeah, beautiful. So to sum it up,
Mm-hmm.
step one, the first thing you can do is awareness. Awareness is the beginning of all of it, right? Be aware of your emotions. Don't push them away. Embrace them and drop into the body. Where are they in your body? What do they look like? What do they feel like? What do they smell like? What do they, I often give that practice to my clients. If you were to paint it, what does it look like? Where, because it's important for us to sit with it. And it is a practice. So the part two is the caveat is this is not a quick fix. It's a life process. And
Daily.
so if we could get rid of this idea that you are broken, you see a healer and you're fixed, then I think it would be a lot easier for everyone to understand that we are constantly doing this work, that we're constantly replenishing, and the stresses are coming in and we're processing them, and we are, it's like rolling healing, right? And it goes on, and we get better at it over time. But yeah, the takeaway here is that there is no quick fix. There is no pill to take, literally or figuratively, where you're going to be better. That this is it's a life choice. It's like, for example, being on a diet to lose weight. That might help you in a short term. A massage might feel good in the moment, but we're not doing the deep work. So if you want to lose weight, you have to change the way you eat consistently. It's not just a 6-week diet or something like that, right?
Right. One important distinction is that especially in our culture here, and the fact that we live so much up in our heads, is that there's such a disconnect on an emotional level. Many people struggle to access their emotions at all. Some cannot even identify feelings. When that's the case, I'll tell people, it's like, well, if you're not actually experiencing the actual emotional response itself, breathe into the physical sensations of your body. If your body's tensing up in your neck and shoulders, or up in your jaw, down in your abdomen, you feel this tensing up. But a lot of people tend to go off into visualizations, and we could easily wander off into all kinds of fantasy tangents doing so. And so, as much as possible, if you're dealing with a stressful, upsetting, challenging situation, be it with the person you're partnered with, or maybe the person you're wanting to be with who's not reciprocating your love, your work, family member, whatever, instead of just wandering off into visualizations, the important thing I want to emphasize is feeling, like, not how does it think, or the visual imagery or what color you're seeing. It's like, what are the deepest feelings? Is it sadness? Is it insecurity? Is it anger? Or what kind of feelings? And for that matter too, there's a whole spectrum of feelings. So there will be other situations where you might be feeling elation or anticipation, or just that enjoyment of being with your partner, for instance, that feeling of warmth and closeness. You can breathe into these feelings as well. And these kinds of emotions, they actually have a nourishing effect within your body as you work with them, help you to become more embodied.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I like to bring all the senses in, but yeah, that's it. That's definitely yeah, and going deep with it, and going deep with it's not just the surface thing. Sometimes it's like anger, what's underneath the anger, you know?
Mhm.
So
And
beautiful.
oh,
Oh yeah,
and
go ahead.
emotions will often go through a progression, like maybe it starts with anger and you keep breathing with the anger. And and as you do so, maybe it will transition to sadness,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes resignation, not necessarily in that specific progression, but when you breathe into the emotion, stay with it for however much time it takes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to keep coming back to the same issue for days,
Right.
weeks,
Right.
longer. But as you keep returning, and the emotions will go through this transition, and even profound grief or pain as you stay with it. Um, at times in my 20s, when the pain was so excruciating, I would stay with it and my whole body would be racked with it. But at a certain point, I could feel it breaking open, come out of my body in waves,
Mm.
and profound emanations of warmth, and um, this presence emanating from the core of my being, and this I could feel this connection to a higher power. And so the more we teach ourselves to stay present with whatever it is we feel, the um, the more we activate, we engage our body and mind's own innate healing intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
Mhm.
That's a beautiful place to rest it for this episode. How
Good.
can people reach you, Ben?
Um, the best way to reach me, my website is Ben Oofana, Ben, Ben, or Ben, then Oofana .com. And yeah, so benufana.com. My Google Voice number, it's not safe to give my regular number, but my Google Voice number, where you can leave a message and I will call you back, is 332 5155.
Okay, I just wrote it down so I could put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Great.
Mhm.
Google Voice. Thank you, Ben. I feel like we only just touched the surface of so much of your work, but I
Good.
so appreciate you being here, and I think you've given listeners a lot to feel.
Mhm. Lot to chew on.
Yeah. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.